For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means.
Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Tonight's featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Welcome to the Republic News Network for our live national broadcast. You may call me Kelby, and tonight I'm going to be acting as your moderator. The RNN, which stands for the Republic News Network, has been doing this radio show since 2010, and it's always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. Here we go. It's true. The United States is a federal corporation, and their exclusive jurisdiction is in the District of Columbia. The Republic government was simply a bunch of U.S. citizens that in law don't have access to the Bill of Rights, and they realized they wanted to be Americans as our founders and our law provided each and every one of us. See, we've been hard at work since 2008, and since 2010, we have successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know, it's hard to understand. Don't worry. We are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government, and we love our country. You can consider the Republic members are tired of the corruption that we see every day. See, we found in the law that there is two forms of government here on the land, and we did something about it. We are people. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We have families just like you. We simply found some truths, and now we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you too are about to be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel and your Republic if you so choose. But before we go into our broadcast tonight, please bow your head in prayer.
Father, we want to thank you for this opportunity to come to More Truth and to share how to properly run a governmental body. Lord, bless these people, bless Dan Happel, and guide us in all that we do. And we pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Dan Happel, I yield the floor.
Well, thank you, Kelby. Tonight we have a special guest on our show. We have Jim Carlson on, and the name of our program is The Responsibility and Role of Local County Governments and Why Regionalism and Federal Overreach Must Be Stopped. And I had the great pleasure of having Jim on with Harriet Hageman, who has been on our radio show before as well, on Tuesday on my radio show that I'm doing on the Micro Effect Network. And Jim was quite a surprise. I was really pleasantly surprised that he had such an incredible grasp of all the issues of regionalism and coordination and such a broad reach on so many different things. And as many people know, I was a county commissioner for a time, and these are a lot of the issues that he is addressing are issues that I tried to address when I was a commissioner. And he has done a much better job because he's got 100% of the research and law to make sure that his ideas stick and that they work. And he doesn't have nearly the, let's say, the resistance because, frankly, he's done such a great job of preparing that he pretty well blows the opposition away. And so with that, Jim, I'd like to introduce you to our listeners, and I would like you to give maybe a little bit of a background on the work that you're doing, and then maybe we can start out with a discussion of your opinion of federal overreach.
Well, good evening, Dan. Thank you for what a good introduction. They're really not my ideas. so I should start with that. The ideas that I'm presenting are simply we're going off and we're going out and we're dusting off the history of the founding fathers. We're dusting off statutory law, and then what we're doing is we're taking that and then we're looking at administrative government, and we're asking the question, how do the rules and the regulations and all the things that we see in administrative government today, how does that square? How does that fit with what we see historically in statutory law? For example, the organic statutes that were brought for U.S. Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management, and so how did those agencies come along, and what were the congressional mandates that originated, Dan, the foundations of those agencies, and so what are their organic mandates? And so that's what we did, is we said, what are their organic mandates, and then what happened? And so we asked that question. How we got our start, I live in western Kansas, and how we got our start is I had a history in industry, but then we had in the area, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wanted to list the lesser prairie chicken as a threatened species under Endangered Species Act. And so I was practicing in my engineering practice, doing kind of living life normally, and then my land was involved in that listing. And so having a history in compliance, that drew me in. And then I started running into people in local government. We started researching together and realizing that the statutes and the laws and the powers, the Ninth and 10th Amendment police powers, Dan, that govern county commissions, or that actually give them power, they don't govern them, those powers, county commissioners typically do not have an understanding of their powers under the 9th and 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, their police powers, and their responsibilities. That's one. And then two, we in America have very, very little understanding of where the responsibilities of the federal government, where they stop, where the states pick up, and then where county governments, so there's about 3,028 county governments in America, plus or minus, what are the responsibilities, the jurisdictional responsibilities of each of those entities, and how do they square with one another? So that's kind of the introduction, Dan. It was, your invitation was very broad. So maybe if you want to ask me specific questions, you can direct the show, and we can go down the road there.
Oh, sure. Well, I did want to start out with, first of all, a kind of a general broad brush impression that you have from all the research and all the work that you've done. Just how extensive is the, in general terms, the federal overreach and the administrative law? How far have they gone beyond their constitutional and legal mandates under U.S. code?
I can, and I'll try and be general, but really what happened is we have to go back to the philosophies of progressivism. There's really two philosophies that are outworking here and what we're seeing that are bearing fruit in today's administrative culture. And those philosophies were really promulgated and by Woodrow Wilson. And so he was really the architect. Woodrow Wilson was an academic, and so he promoted the idea that administrative government that the people of America would be much better off if administrative government was outside the reach of politicians and political processes. And so that philosophy was picked up again, Dan, and then FDR really put wheels on it. And so FDR added between 1933 and 1936, FDR added about 100 agencies. There were about 60 or 70 federal agencies at that time in the 30s. FDR added 100 more agencies, and then from there, then we had Lyndon Johnson, and then Jimmy Carter, and the Bushes too. It's not just a D problem. There are R's involved, and then really Barack Obama just exploded the administrative government. And so what we see now really are, and this is really important for your audience, Dan, is that we see administrative agencies really they violate the separation of powers that was envisioned and codified in the U.S. Constitution. And by that I mean that you have the executive, judicial, and the legislative branches. And so who makes the laws? Legislative branch. The judicial branch adjudicates complaints, and they rule only with the law on the case at hand. And then we have the executive branch, execute. And so they're to execute what the legislative branch has codified. So what has happened is now is administrative agencies have now taken on characteristics of all three branches of government. Okay, Environmental Protection Agency, for example, Internal Revenue Service, and others. There's about 8 or 10 that have administrative courts. They can issue penalties. They issue rules, and so they've really taken on characteristics of all three branches. And so now what's happened is that the U.S. Congress has really become they only make a handful of laws by comparison to the thousands of laws, and there are actually rules, and we can talk about this as soon as you wish, Dan. That raising the question, are the regulations that are promulgated by administrative agencies, are they actually law? And we can raise that question if you wish, but. So now we have these agencies that are really, they have all characteristics of all three branches of government, and they're now imposing these rules that are really stifling and choking state governments and bleeding counties, and it's really a top-down structure that we've morphed into. And so there's philosophical aspects, there's legal aspects, the judiciary is implicated, the Congress has not pulled back on the agencies. Every once in a while, an agency will get their hands slapped by, and they'll say, well, let's cut their budget, and it starts out at 50%, and then they cut 2% of their budget or something like that. So really the reforms that need to take place, and Dan, then I'll turn it back to you, as we see them, is really we shouldn't focus on the congressional side of government. Everyone goes to the Congress and they say, oh, we need to elect our senators, and we need to get good House members in there, and we certainly do need good legislators. But I would submit that the real reforms need to take place in administrative government, and there's a way to do it, and we're doing it. And we being Kansas Natural Resource Coalition and Stillwater, our idea is now where we're putting wheels on ways to affect administrative government in a way that challenges them and brings county governments who have parity, who have legal parity, and gives them a rightful seat at the table in land use discussions. And so I would say that's where I'd start, Dan.
Okay, well, I think our listeners, we've done a number of these radio shows where we've identified that administrative agencies right now are writing somewhere north of 95% of all new rules and regulations. And obviously what we're going to talk about tonight will be the legitimacy and the legality of that process and their ability to write laws. It just doesn't exist under our Constitution. And then on top of that, we now have non-governmental organizations, radical environmental groups, non-governmental organizations, tax-exempt foundations, who are acting as the trainers and the facilitators and really staffing much of those administrative agencies so that we've got a really stacked deck. So not only do we have a fourth branch of government in administrative branches, but we also have a fifth branch of government in non-governmental organizations and what I call, tax-exempt foundations, which are completely beyond any control by any of our voters or beyond the control of Congress, because they've abdicated much of their power. And so I guess that's a good place to start. Let's talk about the fact that most new rules, most new powers that seem to be enforced by agencies like the BLM and the Forest Service and many of these public lands agencies, most of these rules are being written in-house, and most of them have very little constitutional mandate.
Yes. We want to stop short of saying that regulations or rules that are put out don't carry the force of law or are not legitimate. And
they carry the force of law, but are they constitutional?
Well, I'll leave that to the scholars. I would submit that if the Congress has mandated that there are tests, there are congressional tests that have come through time, that the Congress will, for example, make a law, a statute, or make a law and a statute, and then they'll hand it over to the executive branch. And the Congress is supposed to draw the lines. They're supposed to draw the framework. And then the executive branch is throughout time, and this is historically, the executive branch, for example, there's a case called Wyman versus Southern, and that's in 1825, and Butfield versus Stranahan. And in there, the Supreme Court had ruled that the executive branch may only fill in the details. And what we're talking about here, Dan, is the delegation, the principle of delegation. Can the Congress delegate to the executive branch details that can be carried out in terms of regulation? And I would submit to you that yes, they can. But what the Congress has to give them, and then there was another court case, Panama Refining Company versus Ryan, where there's intelligible principles. The Supreme Court said, listen, there needs to be intelligible principles by with which the executive draws lines and gives the Congress gave the executive specific marching orders, if you will, and so. Those are, and then the executive can carry that out, and that's a legitimate use of delegation power. Then the Administrative Procedures Act, that came along in, I believe, the 1950s. And this is, I'm going to lead into some tools in the toolbox, too, because I'm a practical guy. And what we want to do is we don't want to just lament and arm wave and say, the sky is falling, this is really bad, even though it is. But what we want to do is, in the end of the day, we want to do something about it. And I think that's what we're about, is we're saying, listen, this is a problem, but you know what? We're Americans. We believe in American exceptionalism. Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's get to work, and let's straighten this thing out. And so I'm very, very positive. I think that we've got a problem, but I believe in the system, and I believe the foundation is intact in our wonderful congressional system. And so I would submit this, Dan, is that rules that go through that fit the statutory mandates and that fit the delegation principles that have been doled out by the Supreme Court, and then have been through the administrative process, meaning that they have been submitted, they've been out for public comment. The public has had a chance to comment. Those comments don't necessarily have to be incorporated, but they've been considered, and they've gone through the process. I would submit that that's legitimate binding law that the agencies can carry out. Now, the problem we have right now is agencies, and this has really happened in the last generation, probably the last 20 years, it's really accelerated, is agencies now don't even go out for comment. They don't even submit their rules for comment, and they just do it. And I would submit to you, Dan, that those regulations are illegitimate. And I would say that they're not law, but I would say this: they're commands. And so they're commands, but they're not law. And then you get into policy, and you get into guidance, and you get secretarial directives, and all of these things that are really obscuring the landscape. And so it's important for us as county commissioners and state governments and the people of America to sort those things out.
Well, I completely agree with most of that precept, Jim, but one of the things that I must stress, even though these agencies do have the right to flesh out these requirements under congressional action, under the administrative branch of government, they have the right to flesh those out, but they still have to be constitutional mandates. They still have to meet the litmus test. Are they legitimate under our U.S. Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and under U.S. Code? Am I right on that?
Yeah, I'm okay with that, and I think how I would put it is this: there's a hierarchy of law. And the hierarchy of laws, our system is built on the Constitution of the United States. So that is the and by the way, the Constitution of the United States, many of the principles come from the Magna Carta, and then
correct.
Before
and
that,
common law,
and then before that, then the common law, and then the law that came down from the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus and Numbers.
Right.
So. And that's
law.
why our system is so great. But I would submit to you that there's natural law that the system is built on, that's in the Constitution, and then from there is we have this hierarchy of law that one has to roll up. The principles one has to roll up into the next. And so, for example, I'll use an example in Minnesota. The Minnesota legislature in 2015 came out with a buffer statute. Okay, and a buffer is basically a riparian. It's a vegetative buffer that between agricultural land that buffers runoff from agricultural land and filters it before it goes into streams. And they took 50 feet on both sides of every stream in Minnesota in the agricultural area, or many of them. There's a map. And then they said, you farmers, you agricultural interests, have to take that land out of production, and you have to install a vegetative buffer. And then from there, then you have to maintain it, and it has to meet state specifications. Now, this private property take amounts to about 12 acres per stream mile. It takes land out of production. The farmers and agricultural interests still pay tax on it, and the state has the right to inspect those buffers and come onto private property. That is way outside, Dan. That is way outside the threshold of the founding fathers and private property.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And Jim, we had a similar thing in Madison County when I was commissioner. Luckily, we defeated it, but they're going to continue to bring it back, and that is to put an exclusionary zone where you can do nothing, use it in no way, anything within 500 feet of the major rivers and within 100 feet of any tributary or even seasonal streams that lead down to those rivers. And when you take that total land into account, it's over 40% of the land in the area.
Yes, and they call them buffers.
Correct.
And one of the issues, well, there's several issues with that, and those are, by the way, in one of the reports, the reports that are on that I submitted to you, but there's a bigger picture here that we need to understand, and the bigger picture is the concept of regionalism and what this is doing, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Is environmental regulations go back to one of the planks in Marxism, and that's where, and remember Stalin's land use plans, and actually it goes back to that. And so the idea is that we're now, instead of having county boundaries, geopolitical boundaries, sovereign boundaries, now what's happening is we're now regulating based on physical characteristics of the land. and that's a marked shift in using the guise of environment. And so now, if we and we as Americans, we're rigid with fear, and because we don't want to appear like we're anti-environment. But what has happened is we're redrawing lines. Now we're redrawing political lines based on environmental characteristics and watershed characteristics and those kinds of things. And we're just by virtue of how we're regulating, Dan, those how we're regulating. And so it's this insidious regulatory regime that is affecting political boundaries, and it's a big picture. There, I believe that there is a philosophy and there is something behind that. And of course, we call it.
Well, I'll be the one to say it, Jim, so that you don't have to take the heat on this. But it's UN Agenda 21, and it's called sustainability, and it is a project that is being touted by the United Nations as a way to basically create regional governments, to create sustainability in their precept, which is really goes back to communism. And the bottom line is, when we lose our rights to utilize our own property, and when we don't have elected officials that are willing to stand up and protect those rights for the individual citizens through their power as local government, we are losing our country.
Right. Well, and I think we become serfs on the land.
Correct.
And so and I'm really, really good with that. Now the question is how. Let's take a look, maybe, Dan, if we will, at let's use the buffer law in Minnesota, because Minnesota really is on the forefront of the outworking of these agendas, and there's several things going on in that particular state that we're now becoming effective at pushing back. And the watershed districts now are they're redrawing lines of watershed districts. They'll still say, "Oh yeah, you have your county boundaries," but yet we're gonna regulate based on watershed characteristics, and so we're moving in that direction. And so I would submit to you that there's two things that counties possess, two things that are unique to the American system of government, with which county commissioners should take and put in their toolbox, and through the land use planning process, call federal agencies to account to come to the table in parity to discuss. And those two things are this, Dan. The first is geopolitical boundaries. Geopolitical boundaries. Those lines were drawn on the map, and when for a purpose, and they're in the state constitution. Now, how county commissioners would utilize this tool is this. Let's say, for example, the Clean Water Act or Waters of the U.S. rule. In county land use plans, you could have something in your land use plans that said if a federal or a state rule has impacts or has the opportunity to impact boundaries in a material way, then you have to show us the studies and the impact studies and those kinds of things, bringing the agencies to the table. And so, for example, the streams cross county boundaries, and see, now we're starting to say, no, we're going to regulate by watersheds, not by geopolitical boundaries. It was never the Founding Fathers' intent to regulate by physical characteristics.
Right. And what you're talking about, Jim, is coordination. And that is something that was really created as one of the processes, part of the Federal Land Policy Management Act in 1976, to create a vehicle that allowed participation by counties and state governments in the land planning process.
Yes. And really, I would submit to you that in FLPMA they codified coordination, and that's where they actually defined it, Dan. But
yes.
the doctrine of coordination goes back further, all the way to the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, because that's the police powers that counties possess. And I use the example of this is that who has the final police powers in the nation, and that is the county sheriff.
No, that's correct.
The sheriffs in county, and that's just absolutely huge. And so now FLTMA applies to public lands, and it's important to distinguish that. But the doctrine of impermateria, which says that like-kind statutes are to be interpreted in the context of one another, is applicable here. And so FLTMA has to do with federal lands, counties, because some counties, particularly in the East End, do not have public lands, and so typically agency people will say, "Hey, listen, FLTMA doesn't apply to us there," and really they're somewhat incorrect in saying that. But the doctrine of coordination shows up in the Endangered Species Act. It shows up in the National Environmental Policy Act, and the doctrine and the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act of 1960. So it's been around. What I'd like to do though is that there's been a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fuzziness on what coordination is. And if I could speak to that, Dan, I'd like to.
Oh, I'd love to have you do that. As a matter of fact, we had a major coordination effort in the state of Montana when I was a county commissioner. And we had a unanimous approval to support a coordination bill in the state legislature. And when we finally got it crafted and put together and took it before the state legislature, we had a legislator, in fact, a number of them that were willing to carry it and were happy to carry it. And lo and behold, some of the same counties that voted in favor of it, and the Montana Association of Counties, who moved that forward for approval, came forward and testified against it. And they said, well, we weren't really included in the drafting of this bill, and we don't like some of the language, but in fact we were just following what the coordination statutes say. And
yes.
What American Stewards of Liberty and a number of these other groups who have done a lot of research on it, and they know what they're talking about. And we just tried to run with that, but I have to tell you, a lot of county governments are afraid of coordination because it means that they're going to have to work a little harder.
It does, and there's also an opportunity. It creates the opportunity for conflict, and I think there's something even more that's uncertain for commissioners is it's difficult to understand, and so we can go. You and I, Dan, we have a track record in and a passion, I would submit, just for the short time I've known you, for ferreting these things out and understanding them. But your average county commissioner, they're in our area, they're working people, and they serve their elected people, and they're regular guys and regular gals, and they're living life and raising families and all of that. And so typically what happens is they go to your Minnesota Association of Counties or your Kansas Association of Counties, and those entities, those associations, typically school commissioners on how to really carry out the public dole. And
bingo.
And so I think that though there's those associations are mature and they protect their relationships. So in their defense, they even do not understand they either don't understand, or maybe some of them are turning a blind eye in some cases, perhaps. But I think that associations have matured, and so county commissioners they're torn, and there's a lot of self-study that goes on. But or must go on in order to understand these principles. And so when we talk about coordination, it's a process. And it's a process. In order to coordinate, you have to have something to coordinate with. For example, let's say a U.S. Forest Service up there in Montana comes and they're going to revise their resource management plan in one of the forests up there. And it's a 20-year revision, and they come out. And so county commissioners, we've had this before, county commissioners will come out and they say, okay, we want to coordinate. And the Forest Service people know they have to do that. They understand they have to do that. And so they'll say, okay, what do you want to coordinate with? And so what has to happen is that we have to have a credible land use plan in place. Counties have to have a credible land use plan in place that they understand that the U.S. Forest Service comes in coordination with. And in fact, the FLTMA Title II statutes in 43 U.S.C. 1711, Section A, land use planning, says that the federal agencies have to achieve consistency with your land use plan. What that means is it subordinates the federal processes to your land use plan.
Right.
Now,
let me just insert something in there, Jim, and you can remark on this. But in Montana, many of the counties in Montana don't have a county land use plan. But in those areas that don't, we have recommended, or at least a number of us have recommended, that they create a natural resource plan,
yes,
which gives them the basis to coordinate with federal agencies.
Yes, and in fact, I'd be willing to share one that we did for Kansas Natural Resource Coalition. KNRC is a block of 32 counties who've come together, and our county commissioners in KNRC are well educated. And so whenever Fish and Wildlife Service or the agencies come up to our commissioners, they're well schooled in this, and that's exactly right, Dan, is a natural resource land use coordination plan, or land use plan, or natural resources plan. And I would there's other opportunities too where counties could have a joint plan, but that gets a little more. That's not as effective because agencies will say, "Hey, this is just a generic plan and it doesn't have anything specific in it."
Right.
So, and to their credit, I think we need to look across the table and look at our counterparts, our federal counterparts, which I always, and Dan, you heard me say this on Tuesday, is we always treat our federal and state counterparts with dignity and respect, and even if we think they're incorrect, and even the environmental groups. I'll come up against environmental groups, and there's some of them that really, really don't like me. But yet I always treat them with dignity and respect, and so and they still say what they're going to say. But with that said, coordination is a process, and it's a process where you say you, federal agency, in our example, the U.S. Forest Service, have to attempt consistency with our local land use plan, and they'll say okay. They come in and you start working through the details, and there's so many important things about that, Dan. So many important things. For example, in the Organic U.S. Forest Service Act of 1897, the U.S. Forest Service has two missions in life, and only two. One is to ensure a ready supply of merchantable timber from public lands to the American people. Two, that the flow of water to the streams is balanced. That's water quantity. That's not water quality. U.S. Forest Service has absolutely no jurisdiction over water quality whatsoever, and they have no jurisdiction over groundwater. So, given that, there's also law that points to that that local people. This is case law now. That local entities like counties should have access to cut firewood into our national forests. So in that case, we need to get back to, I would say, we need to get back to thinning our forests and building roads to ensure that a ready supply of merchantable timber and flow of water to our streams so that those streams are balanced. And so that could be part of the natural resources plan that we're talking about, Dan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Jim, I have to agree with you completely about being polite and civil and trying to work as best you can with these various agencies, because I've known and worked with these agencies for years, and the fact is they're staffed with very nice, very legitimate people, and they're working with regulations and rules that they have really no understanding of, other than the fact they're told to follow them, and that's kind of part of the fly in the ointment. And I'd like you to explain how they are asking their federal employees to follow rules and regulations that most of those people really don't understand.
Not only that, with change of administrations, now this takes us to the organization of administrative government. So let's take Department of Interior, for example, and then, of course, U.S. Forest Service is Department of Agriculture. So, and I think that we need to move U.S. Forest Service under Department of Interior. And we've, Dan, you have some writings that we have submitted to the President as part of his reorganization request on your email, and those documents
right.
certainly can be shared. But what I would say there is the local people are our friends and neighbors typically, but when an administration changes, these people are given different directives. And I think there's the rub, Dan. Is you'll see, for example, in Minnesota, we had U.S. Forest Service proposal withdrawal of 235,000 acres of minerals in the last 2 weeks of the Obama administration. And it set aside those lands for a 2-year process, and it created this long-standing bureaucratic chain of events that needs to be worked through. But the folks that are hardworking folks that are on the ground are really susceptible to the edicts from above. And so I really encourage, and often, and Dan, here's another thing that I've found, is often the folks at the local level do not understand, they don't understand the statutory law that they're implementing.
Right.
But they're operating off a policy manual, and so when we go into discussions with them, we say, listen, you might as well scooch that policy manual off the desk, because we're going to talk about statutes, and we're going to talk about case law, and those are the controlling law behind within the discussions we're going to have. And so in the outworking of those processes, we reach into the statutes and we look across the table and say, okay, how do we achieve the objectives of managing forests for a supply of merchantable timber that's consistent with the goals of county governments?
Excellent. And you mentioned the policy manuals that these agencies follow, and I'd like you to get a little bit into the detail on that, because so many of those policy manuals really don't have a thing to do with the original mandate, and quite frankly, they're contrary to U.S. law.
Yes, we found that also, and so I think that we just say, I alluded to it earlier, scoot it off the desk. But county commissioners and landholders are we're hesitant to do that. we're told that these are rules, and we're told that this is law, and so there's tension there when they say, hey, wait a minute, I'm going to use this to regulate you, and you're saying, well, no, we shouldn't do that, and these aren't law, and so I think that's where we have to go back to the organic hierarchy of law, the Constitution, the statutory law, and the case law that forms the basis for the original agency mandates.
Okay, excellent.
And then
would you like to get a little bit into some of the details on how local governments can be effective in really bringing these statutory rules, these laws out, and being able to, let's say, disassemble what is policy and what is real statutory law and case law?
Yeah, I mean, I would. There's so much here for 1 hour.
True. Yeah.
So it's difficult, but I think first of all is to have a solid natural resources plan or land use plan. And by the way, that's not the same as zoning. Many county commissioners, when they hear coordination plan or land use plan, they think zoning, and they're very different animals. So it's important to distinguish between those. But have in place a natural resources plan if you can. Two, understand, for example, the planning processes. For example, there are notification requirements whenever U.S. Forest Service wishes to go through the resource management planning process. And Dan, this is where now when it comes to, let's say, for example, things get somewhat adversarial. We do not, now this is really big take-home message, so if you got your pen, here's the take-home message, is historically we start getting into the science. We get mired in the science, and agencies always win when the debate comes to the science. What we need to do is focus on procedure. Focus on what they have to do. That is notifications. Did they do their notification right? Were they timely in it? Have they done their inventories? For example, Bureau of Land Management is under Federal Land Policy Management Act Title I, and is required to maintain an inventory of public lands. Now, when we go into monument discussions, that becomes very germane to the discussions. The same with inholdings, inholdings of private property. We saw during the Obama administration a number of lands that were sequestered under monuments, and there's some in Montana. And during that, there were inholdings there of private property. And the Antiquities Act of 1906 speaks specifically to inholdings. So when we're looking at these things, what does the statute say, and what do they have to do, and we put it before those that are sitting across the desk from us or the table, and we say, explain to me, let's talk about monuments, explain to me how you Forest Service, or not Forest Service, but that would be National Park Service, how you have taken into account the private property land inholdings during this monument set-aside. How are you going to protect those private property interests that are required to be protected in the Antiquities Act of 1906? The Antiquities Act, Dan, is amazingly simple. It's got three elements. It says that the president can only designate lands if they're situated on land owned or controlled by the federal government. 2, that those parcels are confined to the smallest area compatible with the monument. And 3, that the parcel, if there is an unperfected claim on private lands, that those landholders are given an opportunity to maybe relinquish it to the federal government. So when we're sitting across from them, and in these discussions, National Park Service, and we have land in holdings in monuments. We ask them how they made provision, and I'm going to get back. I know I'm not getting off point too far, but we'll ask them how you maintain access. There's the key. How are you maintaining access to the private in holdings within the monument boundaries? Now, we see this problem. You've probably seen it in Montana.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where you have private in holdings, and this is going on in Colorado and in Utah and in Arizona, where there will be this national forest that was promulgated or set aside after the private property's holdings were there, and then the Forest Service will stop maintaining the roads. And so the property owners will come forward and they'll say, hey, we'll maintain the road ourselves. And then the Forest Service will say, well, we're not going to issue you a permit.
Right. We've seen that happen a bunch.
And what that means, and guess who, and you know this, Dan, who you sell property to. Or who, and I'm going to get to a tool here. But is the only government's the entity you can sell that property to. Here's the tool now. Here's the tool for your toolbox. Is that whenever that happens, you go and you survey that road, and you go down to your county, and you get a in perpetuity easement on that road.
Okay, good.
If the Forest Service or land is proposed to be set aside or withdrawn, the first thing private property owners should be doing is scrambling to their local surveyor, surveying that road, and then going down and filing for an easement, an in perpetuity easement.
Excellent. Okay.
So that's another tool in the toolbox.
Jim, let me ask you something, and
sure.
I know we're going to run out of time, so we're probably we're just going to use this as a warm-up for further radio shows down the road, because I can see this requiring at least a couple of sessions to be able to get this fully discussed. But your point under the Antiquities Act is that the national monuments are to be restricted to the smallest reasonable area that services that national monument, and needless to say, the way the national monuments have gone certainly under the Obama administration, but also it went that way under Bill Clinton. They went for the maximum land size they could possibly grab.
Right. Lands owned or controlled by the federal government. And if you know somebody that was, and I'll use the word victim, of a monument, and they've got private in holdings, they should Google and access the advisability of designating the Bears Ears as a monument. That it's out there for public consumption, and that has lots and lots of good information in it on how to address this. But Dan, I would bring something else because maybe I'll kindle your interest with this. County commissioners can hold public hearings. We did that on the Lesser Prairie Chicken. We had 32 counties. We had a 2-day public hearing. We had a court reporter. We had our own public hearing on whether or not the Lesser Prairie Chicken, the science existed for the Lesser Prairie Chicken to be designated as a threatened species under Endangered Species Act. And then we documented it, and that's out there in if you want to Google "Finding of Facts and Conclusions of Law" by the Kansas Natural Resource Coalition. Well-written document and loads and loads of information there. So county governments can get together and they can have public hearings, and then they can put that information in as part of the comment process to for example, the economic impacts, the cultural impacts, etc. of the proposed federal initiative.
Right, and one of the things that I think always gets swept under the rug and is one of the most important things for private property and really what is part of our national heritage of an understanding of the value of private property is the fact that so many of our county commissions allow some of these regulations to be, I won't say put into place, they're just used by the federal agencies without trying to do anything to make them define the reason for that and the impacts on private property surrounding those public lands. And that's
right.
a huge issue.
And there, one of the tools in the toolbox there is the environmental impact statement under National Environmental Policy Act. Typically, we view NEPA as negative, but if you read the regulations in 40 CFR 1500 by the Council on Environmental Quality, and those are the regulations that actually spell out what has to happen, Dan, in the environmental impact statement, they have to quantify cost, benefit, and impacts to culture and customs of local people. And that's not just our indigenous Native American friends.
Right.
And
right.
so
that's the property owners.
That's property owners. That's ranchers. That's farmers. That's ag interests. And so NEPA is a two-edged sword that works very, very effective. And so I really, really encourage county commissions. And anytime there's federal dollars tied to something, NEPA applies. That's what's really important here. If there's federal money, for example, if the state is carrying out an initiative that's using federal money, guess what? You can push them to apply NEPA. Now they'll say they won't. And they'll say they don't have to, but there are linkages you can make and nexuses you can make. And by the way, when you first start doing this, do not, when the federal agencies say we don't have to do that, don't throw up your hands and say, well, they said they don't have to do it. Because they say you get a lot of no's. It's like when I got married. I got a lot of no's before I got the yes. You get a lot of no's from federal agencies. They say we don't have to do that, and then you keep pressing up the chain. And don't stay with your local office. Work your way up the chain and be resolved and be resilient.
Okay. Well, Jim, we're getting awfully close to the end of our hour, and what I really want to do is give you a few minutes to be able to tell our listeners how they can contact you, how they can find your your information on some of the things you've been working on and some of your websites and some of that information. So I'll give you the last couple of minutes to do exactly that.
Oh, well, thank you. We have there's two ways to contact us. First, I'm the executive director of the Kansas Natural Resource Coalition, a coalition of counties. And so my email there is jcarlson@knrc.org. And then we also have a company that we use to pay the bills because counties don't typically have the resources, and so we reinvest our money into county governments because we believe in these issues. And so that company is called Stillwater Technical Solutions, and my email address there is jcarlson@wbsnet.org. That is jcarlson@wbsnet.org. There's also, Dan, I gave you a lot of documents. I don't know if you post them. You're certainly welcome to. They're public domain. And so there's the pitch.
Okay, well, we will try to make sure that anyone that's interested in, needless to say, you're welcome to contact me. And anyone that's interested in following up on this, I will do everything in my power to make sure that we provide any information that you need. And it's important that we stand up as Americans and understand that private property is the absolute cornerstone of our system of government. And without private property, we have nothing in this country. And quite frankly, under many of these new regulations, these new environmental rules, and this regionalism and all these things that are coming down from above, as it were, are designed to diminish and then eventually eliminate those rights of private property. And when we've lost that, we've lost our country. And Jim, I am absolutely sure that we're going to have you back sometime soon, because we just barely scratched the surface of this huge subject. And so I would suggest, if you would be interested, I'd love to have you come back another night, maybe in a month or so. I'm usually scheduled out a little bit, so I can't give you anything right away, but I would really enjoy that if you would be interested in coming back, and let's see if we can really start to put some case law and some flesh on what you were talking about tonight, so that our listeners have a little bit more information in maybe a little bit more defined way that might be able to help them when they run into these issues as county commissioners or as property owners.
Thank you for the privilege of sharing.
Well, I look forward to the next conversation we have, Jim, and I look forward to a long and very friendly relationship, because you're definitely on the same page as myself. And I really appreciate what you're doing, and I have to tell you, there is a meeting in Hamilton on Saturday. Karen Bud Fallon is going to be coming to the state, and she's going to be talking about coordination. And I'm going to be over there tomorrow, actually doing a program on UN Agenda 21. So I look forward to having people contact us and ask us about this, and Jim will try to get you on during the day this winter again on our Micro Effect network, because that's an area where we get a lot of agricultural people that in the winter they've got more time to listen to the radio. So we'll work that. And with that said, thank you again, Jim, and thank our listeners for joining us for Connecting the Dots. And Kelby, I turn the show back over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.